On a cold morning in early March 1888 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, United States, Sarah Jane Whiteling rose before daylight. She opened the shutters of a narrow house on South 9th Street and lit the kitchen stove. Her husband, John Whiteling, a streetcar driver and factory hand, would leave for work within the hour. She moved between the small rooms, folding the bedding and setting out cups. The daughter, Bertha, aged 9, still slept beside her slate. The boy, Willie, 2 years old, stirred and called for milk. Sarah filled a tin mug, cooled it with water, and held it to his mouth. Outside carts passed over wet stones. Coal smoke drifted along the street. A man stopped to sell vegetables from his bar row. Sarah counted her coins and went down the steps to buy onions and starch. The grocer Claire greeted her by name. She asked for flour soap and a small packet of Rough on Rats. The purchase was noted in the book. By midday she was back at the stove. John returned briefly for his dinner, spoke little, and went out again. Bertha practiced her reading. Sarah wiped the child's slate and put away the folded washing. From a drawer, she took the new insurance paper, $2 a month, covering sickness and burial, and placed it beneath a Bible on the shelf. When evening came, lamps burned low across the ward. Sarah mended a tear in her husband's sleeve and warmed milk for the boy. The street quieted after the last tram passed. She closed the shutters, checked the latch, and turned down the flame. The house, like others in that quarter, held steady in the dark. No one imagined how quickly its silence would deepen. In March 1888, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, United States, lay under a damp sky. John Whiteling, a streetcar driver and factory hand, came home early from the depot, saying his stomach burned after supper. Sarah fetched a cup of water and mixed a powder from the kitchen shelf. He lay down near the stove while she rinsed the plates. By morning, his pain had worsened. Dr. George Smith examined him and advised rest. On March 20th, John was dead. The doctor wrote inflammation of the bowels on his paper. 2 days later, the funeral cart rolled from the narrow house toward the churchyard. A few neighbors stood by the gate as the small coffin passed. One said the place had been unlucky since winter. Another whispered that spirits might have taken hold. The talk faded as the cart turned the corner. That evening Sarah brewed coffee, folded John's jacket, and placed it in the drawer. The lamps along 9th Street flickered in the wet air. In April, Bertha began to lose her appetite. She said her stomach hurt and stayed home from school. Sarah made thin porridge and kept her near the stove. The girl sat by the kitchen table tracing letters on her slate between small sips. By the third day, she was too weak to rise. Sarah sent a boy from the street to call Dr. Smith. He examined the child and noted fever with sickness of the stomach. He left a bottle of medicine and told her to keep the fire low. On April 24th, Bertha died quietly before noon. The same neighbors gathered at the gate when the small cart came again. One woman said she had spoken it before, that the house was marked. Another crossed herself and answered that such words should not be said near the dead. When Sarah came back from the yard, she cleared the cups and set the child's slate on the shelf. The insurance letter arrived within the week. She placed it under the Bible beside the others. By late May, the boy Willie grew ill. He refused milk and cried through the night. Sarah carried him near the window for air. Dr. George Dietrich came and called it a stoppage of the bowels. He left medicine on the table and went away. On May 26th, the shutters were closed. The doctor returned and found the room still. Sarah folded the child's clothes into a small trunk and sat beside the lamp until the oil ran low. That night, a few neighbors stood near the fence, speaking low. Some said the house was cursed. Others said it was only sorrow. The lamp burned faintly behind the curtains. The house held still. By June 1888, the shutters of the Whiteling house on South 9th Street remained drawn. The curtains stayed shut through the heat. The milkman said no one answered his knock. The children's toys still lay in the yard, half buried in dust. Dr. George Smith, who had attended John and the girl Bertha, began to think about the sameness of their sickness. Each had suffered pain of the stomach, the same vomiting, the same stillness at the end. He had written the certificates himself. When the boy died as well, the pattern stayed with him. One morning he passed the house and saw Sarah on the step. She wore a dark shawl and spoke to a neighbor about her misfortune. The woman beside her said softly that trials came from the Lord. Sarah nodded, wiped her eyes with a handkerchief and went inside. Later that week, the curtains were closed again. No smoke rose from the kitchen flue. 2 women from across the street said she no longer went to the market. Another told the grocer that she sometimes heard crying late at night, though no voice could be told apart from the wind. Dr. Smith waited several more days, then went to the coroner's office on South 5th Street. He spoke quietly of his concern. 3 deaths in one house, all within 10 weeks. Coroner Ashbridge listened, made notes, and ordered that the graves be opened for examination. On the morning of June 10th, 2 constables and Dr. Smith arrived at the churchyard. A few neighbors followed from a distance. Sarah came later wrapped in black, holding a handkerchief to her face. She wept softly when the small coffins were lifted. Some said it was grief, others said it was fear. The coroner stood by recording each name as the lids were sealed again. When the carts rolled away toward the city, the crowd thinned. Rain began to fall across the stones. The sound of shovels faded into the ground. On June 11th, the wagons reached the city. The boxes were carried into a narrow brick building on 13th Street, the laboratory of Professor Leffman. Inside, the air smelled of lime and disinfectant. Glass jars stood in rows on a wooden table. Coroner Ashbridge and Dr. George Smith signed the seals before they were broken. The contents were transferred into clean glass containers. Notes were written as each label was checked. Professor Leffman and his assistant Dr. Fermad moved quietly from table to table, recording each observation. Sarah arrived late that morning, escorted by a constable. She wore the same black shawl from the burial. Her handkerchief was damp in her hand. When the coroner asked if she wished to wait outside, she said she would rather stay. She sat near the door, eyes lowered. The process continued through the day. The sound of glass and paper filled the room. Clerks brought water, adjusted lamps, and copied figures into a ledger. Sarah whispered that she hoped her husband and children would be found free of harm. One of the clerks replied that the truth would show itself soon. By mid-afternoon, the chemical tests were prepared. Drops were placed in small vials, and the mixture began to change color. Dr. Smith noted the result and handed the paper to the coroner. Ashbridge read it once and folded it away. Outside, a small crowd waited near the steps. Some said the woman had suffered too much. Others wondered how she kept so calm. A boy sold newspapers at the corner, calling out news from the courthouse. Before evening, the containers were sealed and placed in a locked case. Sarah left the building slowly, leaning on the railing. The constable followed her to the street. The wagon carrying the evidence moved east toward the river. By mid-June 1888, the examination was nearly complete. In the upper rooms of the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy, Professor Leffman compared his figures with those of Dr. Format. The men spoke little. Papers were numbered, folded, and signed. The faint odor of chemicals hung in the air. Dr. Smith arrived from the coroner's office carrying the earlier certificates. Each case was reviewed. The husband, the daughter, the son. The symptoms matched in order and in time. On a final page, Leffman wrote a single line and drew his initials beneath it. The paper was placed in an envelope marked for Coroner Ashbridge. That afternoon at the coroner's desk on South 5th Street, Ashbridge read the report aloud to Smith and 2 constables. The words were brief. The tests showed the presence of arsenic in considerable quantity. No further comment was made. A clerk recorded the date and the signatures. The folder was closed, the seal pressed down, the file conveyed to the police superintendent. News of the report moved quickly through the district. By evening, neighbors along 9th Street spoke of the laboratory work and said that truth would now come clear. A few recalled that the woman had bought powders at the corner shop. Another said she had warned the grocer not to speak her name. The story went from doorway to doorway. The next morning, Sarah was called to the coroner's office. She arrived with a shawl over her head holding a small purse. When asked about the purchases, she said John had used the powders himself, that sickness had come from the Lord's hand. Her voice stayed even. Ashbridge noted the reply and dismissed her for the day. Outside, rain began again. The Clare locked the file cabinet and covered the lamp with a glass shade. The room emptied. Only the sound of the pen scratching across the last line remained. By week's end, the order was given to hold Sarah Whiteling for further questioning. The document lay on the desk beside the folded reports. In the corridor, footsteps echoed once, then stopped. The lamps along the stairway flickered as the door was closed. At the end of June 1888, the order for search was signed. 2 constables and Dr. Smith went to the small house on South 9th Street. The key was fetched from the neighbor. The front door opened without resistance. Inside, the air was still. A kettle stood on the stove half-filled. Papers lay beneath a Bible on the shelf. The constables lifted each and laid them flat on the table. Among them were 3 insurance receipts dated March, April, and May. Each carried Sarah's signature. In a drawer beside the bed, they found a small paper box marked Rough on Rats. The label was faded. A corner had been torn away. Dr. Smith folded the box in clean paper and placed it in his bag. The constable wrote a line in the report book and sealed the parcel. Outside, a few neighbors gathered near the fence. One woman said she had seen Sarah buy the same powder at the grocer's in March. Another said the shopkeeper had mentioned it once, but thought nothing of it. Then the talk grew quiet when the officers stepped out. Sarah arrived soon after, accompanied by a clerk from the coroner's office. She looked around the room and said she had kept the box for killing mice. No one replied. The constables finished their notes, checked the drawers once more, and locked the door behind them. The parcel and the papers were delivered to the office before dusk. On the Clare's desk, the 3 receipts were set beside the sealed box. Ashbridge read the lines once, closed the file, and said the evidence would suffice. By nightfall, the house was empty again. A single lamp burned in the upper window, then went out. The inquest opened in November 1888 at the City Court, Philadelphia. The room was narrow, the benches full before the first witness was called. Coroner Ashbridge presided. A Clare read the charge in a low voice and noted the hour. Dr. George Smith was the first to speak. He said he had treated the family through the spring and had observed the same pattern in each illness. He had signed all 3 certificates. When the coroner asked what had caused his later suspicion, he replied that the symptoms were alike and that the deaths had come too soon one after another. He added that the powders found in the drawer matched the poison identified in the tests. Professor Lefman followed. He stated that the analysis of the samples showed arsenic a measurable amount and that the substance corresponded to the brand known as Rough on Rats. His assistant, Dr. Fermad, confirmed the report. Both signed the document in court. Elizabeth Gilbert, a neighbor, testified that she had seen Sarah purchase small packets of powder at the grocer's in March. She said the woman had told her it was for rats under the stove. Another witness, a shop Clare, affirmed the sale and said the same words had been used. Later, Dr. Alice Bennett took the stand for the defense. She spoke of the prisoner's weak health and troubled mind, mentioning that long strain and isolation might have affected her judgment. She did not deny the acts, but said the woman seemed unable to tell right from wrong. Throughout the hearing, Sarah sat behind the railing, hands clasped in her lap. She looked down when her name was spoken. When asked if she wished to speak, she said only that she loved her children and hoped to meet them again. The Clare wrote down the sentence without pause. After deliberation, the jury returned a single finding: willful murder of the childbirther, a Whiteling, by arsenic. The coroner recorded the verdict and remitted the case for sentencing. As the court emptied, the lamps burned low over the benches. The sound of chairs scraping across the floor filled the room, then ceased. After the verdict, the papers seized upon the case. For several weeks, headlines in the Philadelphia Times and the Pittsburgh Dispatch spoke of the wholesale poisoner. Each printed its own account of the woman's manner, her shawl, her silence in the dock. Reporters wrote that she had insured the lives of her husband and children for small amounts, $2,147, and had collected the money within days of each death. They said she told the officers that she had feared her daughter would grow sinful and that the boy would keep her from working. Some called it greed, others called it madness. Letters arrived at the prison from women in the city pleading for mercy. One said that mothers were not born wicked, only broken by sorrow. Another said the woman had believed too deeply in heaven. At church gatherings, ministers reminded their listeners that judgment belonged to God alone. On the streets, talk shifted from pity to fear. A grocer in the 9th Street ward said he would no longer sell rat poison without a note. A neighbor told the Evening Bulletin that she had once envied Sarah's quiet house, but now crossed the road when passing it. A few said the place was cursed and should be torn down. Police denied reports that another person had been questioned. The coroner's clerk stated that all tests were complete and no further suspects existed. Still, letters to the editor claimed there must have been help in the matter, a man who brought the powders or someone who advised the policies. No such person was ever found. By early spring of 1889, the case began to fade from the front page. Other trials filled the columns. The Whiteling name remained only in smaller notes beneath the weather report. In the prison chapel, she was said to have prayed each morning for forgiveness. The chaplain wrote that her voice was even that she never asked for reprieve. When April came, the papers stopped printing her name. The city moved on. Weeks turned into months. The file of Whiteling versus Commonwealth moved between offices with no alteration of the verdict. The petition for clemency signed by several women's societies of Philadelphia reached the governor's desk in March 1889. It was read, recorded, and set aside. No further action followed. An internal memorandum from the prison board noted that the case had been handled according to law. All medical testimony, it said, was heard and no evidence of insanity established. The coroner's office submitted a final report stating that the analysis of poison had been repeated and confirmed. In April, a short meeting was held at the Department of Justice. Officials discussed whether procedures in family poisoning cases required revision. One inspector remarked that the signs of such acts were seldom recognized until too late. Another replied that insurance companies must bear their own reform. The exchange was recorded without conclusion. Letters to the Evening Bulletin questioned the delay in execution. Some asked why a woman should hang when men of worse record had been reprieved. Others wrote that pity had already done harm enough. The editors printed both sides and added no opinion. By May, all appeals had expired. The order for execution was signed and returned to the warden of Moymensing Prison. A notice was posted on the board beside the main gate. Few stopped to read it. Inside the coroner's office, the reports were stacked in sequence, bound by a thin cord. A clerk checked the seals once more and noted the time in the margin. When the lamps were turned down that evening, the room fell quiet except for the clock against the wall. The case was considered closed. On the morning of June 25, 1889, the prison yard at Moymensing was closed to the public. The air was still and gray. At 10 o'clock, the warden read the warrant aloud. Sarah Jane Whiteling stood beside the chaplain, her hands held loosely before her. She said she trusted God and hoped her children were at peace. No further words were spoken. After the bell struck the hour, the officials signed their names to the final report. The paper was folded once and placed in the prison ledger. Outside the walls, carts passed as on any other morning. By noon, the notice was delivered to the coroner's office and entered into the city record. Clerks wrote the date in red ink, June 25, 1889. The entry filled a single line. That evening, the lamps along South 9th Street burned low. The house where the Whiteling family had lived remained empty, its windows boarded against the summer rain. Neighbors said no tenant had taken it since the spring. In the newspaper columns, her name appeared one last time between the shipping notices and the daily weather. When night came, the rain fell steady over the stone yard and the city roofs. A single lamp in the corridor of Moymensing flickered once and went.